Welcome to our program, Professor Lucas.
Thank you so much for having me here.
US President Donald Trump had a phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and after this phone call with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, how can you assess the so-called results of this phone call between Trump and Vladimir Putin?
Well, in fact, nothing much has changed between this phone call between Putin and Trump from where we were a week ago. Why do I say that? I think the starting point is the way that Vladimir Putin immediately followed up the call by restating his demands for Ukraine's surrender. He did two things. The first is that he rejected any ceasefire. The way he positioned it is that all arrangements must be agreed with Ukraine. So we have to have talks on everything over the invasion and Russia's demands before there is any end to Russia's attacks on the ground or from the air. Secondly, he used this phrase that the Kremlin adopts for its maximum demands. The main thing is to eliminate the root causes of the crisis. And that, of course, is the phrase that covers Russia's demand that it gets 4 regions of Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, as well as Crimea. It covers the demand that Ukraine be, quote, neutral and demilitarized, that it have little security links with the West, and of course, the demand that sanctions are lifted on Russia. So he summarizes all of this after the call, and all Trump says is, oh, we had a great call. It was an excellent tone, excellent spirit, and Russia and Ukraine will now talk with each other, which means very little. So in an immediate sense, Putin gets what he wants. He plays for time. He does not want the ceasefire. He does not want additional sanctions on Ukraine, on Russia. At least he does not want the U.S. to be involved in those sanctions or involved in the security guarantees for Ukraine. But in a wider sense, this story is now about Ukraine and Europe. It's about how Ukraine and Europe respond with Trump being all over the place, and how Ukraine and Europe, first and foremost, maintain financial security for Kyiv, and how Europe maintains Kyiv's ability on the battlefield to stand up to Russia, whether it's on the front line, whether it's with air defenses, whether it's with Ukraine's own attacks inside Russia. And while Ukraine and Europe do that, they hope to get the adults in the room. In other words, those people in the Trump administration, if not Trump himself, who will work with Ukraine and Europe to maintain that effort to resist the invasion.
From your perspective, has Donald Trump been played by Vladimir Putin again? And why don't his aides, his national security team, just tell him that, sir, Mr. President, you're being played by Vladimir Putin?
Of course, Donald Trump has been played by Vladimir Putin again. You don't need me to tell you that. Just as Donald Trump was played by the Gulf states a few days ago. The problem for any aide is who's going to go in and tell Trump you got played by Putin when Trump will lose his temper and fire that aide. Just as in his first term, Trump fired the defense secretary, he fired the secretary of state. Just as a few weeks ago, he pushed away the national security advisor, Mike Waltz. So what the adults in the room, and I think this probably includes Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine, and to an extent, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, what they have to do is they have to maneuver around Trump. In particular, Kellogg has to talk to Europe, has to talk to Ukraine. And think about what has happened away from these headlines. Think about the fact that the United States in the last few weeks has lifted the suspension of military aid to Ukraine. Now, it's small amounts. I mean, 50 million, for example, in 50 millimeter caliber ammunition, the spare parts for F-16 fighter jets, other technical and training support. But it's still important that there is that link there. Think about the minerals deal, which, even though it's very controversial, and I understand why, has a symbolic importance that it keeps the U.S. interested in Ukraine. because you can't get minerals out of the ground if Russia controls them. So I'm not saying this is the optimum situation. You would like a president who actually knows what is going on and who actually can stand with Ukraine against Putin. But as long as you maintain that contact with an administration in a wider sense, it complements that effort in which Europe is now in the lead, where Europe is trying to step up its own support for Ukraine, be it through military support or financial and economic assistance.
Do you believe that US President Trump could ever lose his temper with Vladimir Putin? Because Putin has been playing with Donald Trump, buying his army even more time for many weeks. Trump said that Ukraine and Russia would begin negotiations right now. However, last week there were negotiations in Istanbul. Russia has demanded unrealistic concessions from the Ukrainian side. Why does President Trump hesitate to put pressure on Putin to just say him, stop, Vladimir, and we are putting pressure on you to force you to a negotiating table?
Yes, Donald Trump can lose his temper with Vladimir Putin. Think back to the end of April when we fully thought that the U.S. was going to walk away from Ukraine entirely. And then Vladimir Putin, I think, miscalculated with an attack across Ukraine, but especially on Kyiv. It killed 12 people and injured 90. And Donald Trump responded on social media by denouncing that attack, quite rightly, and saying, Vladimir, stop. And then it was just a couple of days after that Trump sat down with Zelensky at the Vatican. And Zelensky finally got across to Trump, look, the Russians aren't really interested in a ceasefire. So that put Putin on the defensive. Now, he has regained some ground with what we're discussing here. He's had to do it by granting Trump that one-on-one call Trump has wanted for months. But think about it in a wider sense, why this is not just a case of Ukraine putting up its hands and surrendering. Back in February, the Kremlin had maneuvered Trump to where you had direct U.S.-Russia talks, and Ukraine and Europe were excluded. And then the Kremlin overplayed its hand. Instead of saying, okay, we'll only take parts of 4 regions of Ukraine, not all of them. Instead of saying, okay, we'll allow some military aid to Ukraine. Instead of saying no military aid to Ukraine, they put forth their maximum demands. And they missed the opportunity to get a deal excluding Ukraine at that point, back in February. So Vladimir Putin, in a way, is actually having to try to recover the lost ground. He can do it to an extent because Trump so much wants to be loved by Putin, so much wants to be admired by Putin. But Donald Trump is only one person in that administration. And added to that are 2 things which are significant. Because Russia has misplayed this, there are many Republicans in Congress who now do not want to be allied with the Kremlin and who now are talking about tougher sanctions on Moscow. They're led by Lindsey Graham, who has been a friend of Trump. And secondly, the European Union is about to adopt those tougher sanctions on Moscow. Indeed, they may be doing so as I speak, which means that economically, there's going to be a tighter squeeze on Russia because Putin will not step back from demanding Ukraine's surrender, whether or not Donald Trump is continuing to speak to him on the phone.
Let's also cover interesting meeting between US Vice President J.D. Vance and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Rome this weekend. As we know, this is the first time when President Zelensky and J.D. Vance met after this disastrous meeting in the White House in February this year. How can you assess the results of this meeting, and maybe do you see any kind of a shift in Vance's stance towards Ukraine?
I think this is part of this wider, what you might call not optimistic, but half full assessment. Think back to February 28th, when J.D. Vance ambushed Vladimir Zelensky, when the Ukrainian delegation was thrown out of the White House with no minerals deal. That was an attempt to break Zelensky in the middle of the U.S.-Russia talks. And it failed. It failed because there were others in the Trump administration who continued to talk to Europe, who continued to talk to Kyiv. Now, here we are almost 3 months later, and J.D. Vance, who was saying that the United States should walk away, not just from Ukraine, walk away from Europe, he's having to play nicer. He's having to play nicer with the Catholic Church, with a Pope whom he did not want, Pope Leo XIV. That's another story for another time. And he's having to play nicer with Zelensky and with the Europeans. Now, Vance is still saying Europe has to take care of its own defense, et cetera, but he's not, in effect, saying, we don't like you, we're stepping away from all of this, we're going to give Vladimir Putin an open goal to try to force Ukraine's surrender. Because J.D. Vance wants to be president in 2028. And J.D. Vance knows that he overplayed his hand, that there are a lot of people in the Republican Party, his party, who do not want to be allied with Putin. And Vance was risking, he was beginning to look like he was allied with Putin. So he's adjusting. And that adjustment is something that can be used by Ukraine and Europe. You will not make an ally of J.D. Vance, but you can at least move him more to a middle position as Ukraine and Europe try to take the lead on holding off the Russians.
Let's get back to the February this year. You just mentioned that Vladimir Putin has missed his opportunity to reach a deal on pro-Russian terms in February. Why did he miss this opportunity? Does he still have this opportunity right now? And how can you specify your remarks about this missed opportunity?
I mean, your viewers in Ukraine will know more than a lot of us, where I am in Ireland or in Europe more broadly, about why Putin missed this opportunity. And that is, Vladimir Putin wants his legacy to be making Ukraine part of Greater Russia. I'm not the one who said this. Vladimir Putin said this in a lengthy article in July 2021. Vladimir Putin wants the annexation of at least 4 regions of Ukraine. He'd like to have more, but at least 4 regions of Ukraine, plus Crimea. He wants the Zelensky government removed to put in his own puppet government, one that supports Moscow. He wants Ukraine economically limited while Russia is economically freed. He wants all of this. He does not want to stop short of gaining all of this. In February, the United States was not prepared to support all of that, and Putin made a choice. Rather than reaching a deal with the Americans, he decided to keep pressing, to keep attacking Ukraine at that point. And as I say, I think he misread, not Trump. I don't think he misread Trump, but I think he misread the United States in that the United States is not just simply Donald Trump. There are other politicians, there are other groups who have different opinions about this Russian invasion. And I think most importantly, when he did that, he opened up the space for Ukraine and Europe to try to take the diplomatic initiative. And let's remember that the diplomatic initiative here, and a lot of American media are getting this wrong, the diplomatic initiative here is still for that 30-day ceasefire proposal. Now, let me give you a clue as to why Putin will not accept that. The American outlet Bloomberg, sources close to the Kremlin, and these are people, in other words, who are putting out Putin's line. They talked to Bloomberg a few days ago, and they said, Putin will not make a deal. He will not cease fire because he believes that by the end of 2025, Russia will militarily take all of those 4 regions. And it already holds Crimea, so he doesn't have to stop. Now, I don't think that's actually true. I don't think the Russian military can take all 4 of those regions, even with the U.S. off to the side. But I think those people were signaling this is what Putin believes will happen. If Putin still believes he can conquer Ukraine, he's not going to cease fire. And that is why he missed his opportunity in February. And that's why he's gambling now. And the question is, does he lose that gamble? Does Ukraine, its supporters, whether or not this includes Trump, do they actually show Putin, you cannot win this on the battlefield. You will have to come to the negotiating table.
And don't you think that Putin is overplaying his hand right now because he is trying to achieve his maximalist goals, maximalist objectives, instead of at least reaching out an optimal deal with some kind of concessions from both sides?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that he's overplaying his hand. I mean, we have an expression. I like to play poker cards, and you have an expression which is, you either stick or you double, and you double down your bet here. Putin thinks, I'm just going to keep pressing ahead. He's racing against time. Russia is not going to break down economically. Let's not go down that road. But Russia does have economic limits on how far it can press the military operations. Its growth rate is slowing down. Its interest rates are increasing. Its rate of inflation is increasing. It is suffering because of the lower oil prices, even before you talk about the effect of the sanctions. And I think those tighter sanctions are going to have an effect when they come in from Europe, especially the sanctions on Russian gas. So Putin knows he needs to get this wrapped up this year. He can't go into 2026, I think, with the same opportunity. So that's why he's going to play it so tough. And he's going to keep dangling Donald Trump over Ukraine and Europe. What are you going to do? I've got this guy. What are you going to do? I've got this guy. And you got to call his bluff, to use another poker term. And that is, you think you got Trump? Fine. We think we've got our own resources. We think we've got the international community. We think we could even have some other people in Washington. So let's see, Vladimir. Let's see if you can really actually defeat us.
Just mentioned about the Putin's willingness to continue the war at least to the end of this year. However, during the negotiations in Istanbul, a so-called Vladimir Medinsky, Mr. Medinsky, threatened Ukraine to continue this war for 20 years, more than 20 years, as it was with between Sweden and the Soviet Union. From your perspective, does it mean that Russia is ready to continue this war for a while, for many years, or this is just another Russia's bluff?
It's a bit of both. I mean, it is a signal that Russia is going to continue the war, is not going to cease fire. Let's be honest here. But it's a bit of what we might call chest thumping. Because when a bully doesn't get his way, what does he do? He says, I'm going to punch you again. Give up. I'm going to punch you again. Give up. I'm going to punch you another time. Give up. And that's what Medinsky was doing, because the full expression he was saying is, yeah, we fought Sweden for 21 years in the 18th century under Peter the Great. We're willing to fight a forever war. Are you willing to fight a forever war? Are you willing to put your sons and daughters on the battlefield? Because we are. Well, let's put a couple statements in reality to that. First of all, as a student of history, Russia didn't come out too well out of that war with Sweden in the 18th century. I mean, I know you get to call Peter the Great and all of that, but Russia took a heavy toll in its development in the 18th century and fell behind other parts of Europe because of how much it expended on that war. Secondly, to bring it up to the current date, Ukraine has sacrificed a lot in what is now 39 months of a full-scale invasion. So Ukrainians have showed that they are willing to sacrifice their sons and daughters. I wish they didn't have to, but they've shown they're willing to do so. So if Medinsky, like Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, like Putin himself, are going to thump their chest and act like bullies, well, I think most Ukrainians say, we have to stand firm. We don't accept your bullying. So, Mr. Medinsky, I didn't expect anything else different from him. I don't expect anything else different from Mr. Putin. But let me add one other thing. If Ukraine was willing to give up, I don't think I would see so many Russian installations, oil installations, military bases, and other parts of Russia on fire, because Ukraine, far from giving up, is actually counterattacking when it can.
For how long these negotiations between Trump and Putin could continue from your perspective?
This dance is going to continue indefinitely. I mean, the Kremlin I was waiting for months for the Kremlin to give Trump his phone call, because Trump actually kept lying that Putin called him. If you go back to last November, Trump kept lying Putin was calling him, because he really wanted Putin to call him. And it was like, okay, when's the Kremlin going to give them the call? And the fact here is the Kremlin gave Trump that call, not because it was winning, but because it was on the defensive. It didn't want the 30-day ceasefire. People were calling out Putin for not going to the talks in Istanbul and sending Mr. Medinsky. So all of a sudden the Kremlin says, all right, we've got to do something. We've got to step it up. Now, there's one more card the Kremlin has, which is the face-to-face meeting with Trump. I mean, that's what Trump really wants, because he wants the photograph with Putin. Whether it's in Washington, whether it's in Moscow. When does the Kremlin play that card? Probably when it runs into trouble, whether it's in a month, whether it's in 2 months, or whether it's in 3 months. Because here's the reality in terms of beyond Trump and Putin, because it's not going to yield any results. You know, the war's not going to end with this. Russia's going to continue to fire the missiles and drones, hoping that Ukraine breaks. And I think last night it was about another 138 drones that were fired across, you know, and they'll keep doing this. And occasionally they will launch missile barrages. Ukraine needs air defenses, but they will not give in to those attacks. Russia's going to continue attacking in Donetsk, and it might make marginal advances, but I don't think it breaks through to sweep through Donetsk and then across, for example, Zaporizhia. So Russia's not going to win this war in the next few months. Meanwhile, Russia's going to face tightened sanctions. So sooner or later, Vladimir Putin's going to have to make that decision on when he gives Donald Trump that face-to-face visit and hope that somehow he can finally use Trump to break Europe and to break Kyiv. But you know what? I think we talk too much about Donald Trump being Vladimir Putin's weapon. I think the opportunity is gone, because I think there are others in Washington who do not want to be seen basically as Russia's servant. And that is an asset that Ukraine and Europe can work on in the next few weeks and next few months.
Thank you, Professor Lucas, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.